nobody gets fired for choosing IBM. In supply chain, and I have this quote somewhere, nobody gets fired for choosing SAP. And that may be true, but that doesn't mean you don't get fired, but you don't necessarily succeed either. Because, and this is what they don't tell you, and this is why I challenge supply chain leaders to take ownership of your own destiny. Because you will get partway through the journey, and I think what happens is while leaders don't get fired, it becomes clear they're not going to succeed, so they leave long before the failure becomes apparent. And I think they see it sooner and they move on for whatever reason. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one correlation, but there is this, you can choose the big solution, but that does not guarantee, in fact, that almost guarantees you won't be successful.
Thank you so much for joining another edition of The Never-Ending Climb for a stronger supply chain and procurement for companies running SAP. Today we have the pleasure of Dr. Eloise Epstein. She is an author, futurist, and digital supply chain designer expert extraordinaire. Should really need no introduction. Dr. Eloise, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
When we were talking before, we had the pleasure of being added to your spider map, which is this collection of solutions that are designed around creating more innovation around supply chains. And I know that there's no large suite providers there. There's no Coupa, there's no Ariba, there's none of those big names. And somehow we got on there. Can you share a little bit more about the spider map and just in a nutshell where it came from?
Yeah, so it came from a collective. So everything I write about, everything I research comes from this what I talk to the market, the people that are consumers of this technology, anything in supply chain tech or procurement tech. And there was collective massive amounts of dissatisfaction with the suite providers. And this is going back to 2010 to 2017, when there was a lot of consolidation around the market and everybody was buying into this. The analysts, the systems integrators, the consultants, my current employer included, were casting these fantasies about how you could buy one piece of software and it would solve all of your problems. One
ring to rule them all.
Exactly. And it turned out to be complete and utter nonsense. It was just not realistic. Because what we need in each, whether it's contracting or planning or logistics, is so much more nuanced than one provider can do. And when I realized that, I started to say, oh, you know what? We need a much more extensible architecture. And then I looked at what Salesforce had done, and very successfully in the early 2000s has created an extensible architecture within this Salesforce umbrella. And I was like, yeah, you know what? We need that for supply chain. And that was in 2017. And 7 years on, we still have not solved that. And I think that is probably the greatest. I think we're well on our way, but I think our inability to solve that underlying platform is why we have and why we will continue to have for the foreseeable future such instability in our supply chains.
I think the instability, the way I see it, has this awkward combination of human nature meets complacency meets goal seeking. And the way that we go about that in a large organization has many different opinions and many different advisors around what matters. I'd love to hear, for the groups that are typically, procurement, supply chain, and IT leaders, a few accounts payable folks that watch this, what advice would you have for them in how to think more effectively about automating, digitizing, and adding that intelligence to supply chain in a way that works for IT?
Well, maybe let me answer that by offending the IT people watching and listening, because I know this, that the IT role, the CIO role, has gone through a huge metamorphosis over the last 25 years. And some of it's good. Everything used to be on premise. We used to buy servers based on projected capacity because you couldn't just spin up more capacity at the drop of a hat like you can now. And that was a major transformation that happened to IT from 2000, late 90s to 2010. that era before we really hit the cloud era. And once we hit the cloud era, it changed the IT role. And then you add Salesforce and Workday in there, and that changed the enterprise view of what the CIO's remit was. And so the last vestige of IT relevance in that old way of working is supply chain. Now, for better or worse, of course, supply chain systems are an absolute nightmare mess. And part of it's because when we look at the design, most of our supply chain systems were designed and operate as if everything was within the four walls. But now, and this is the argument I make in my latest book, is we have to look at supply chains as this interconnectivity of multiple third parties or many third parties, like hundreds, if not thousands, and it's democratized. We used to think about it as, I don't know, whatever company, the company is at the top of the pyramid and everybody else is serfs or subservient to that enterprise. And that's not the case anymore. So it's a much more democratized business operating environment. So we have to look at when we exchange data with our 3PLs or our contract manufacturers or our inbound suppliers, we have to be much more nimble in the data exchange. And so all of that's to say is we've gone through this transition on what we need, or going through this transition of what we need in supply chain systems design. At the same time, the CIO and IT are digging their heels in to say, oh, well, we just want one ERP system. And we've moved way beyond that. And as sort of a digitally enabled society or consumers or business environment, but the supply chain systems in IT in particular haven't kept up. And I'll just say that I'm not just solely blaming IT, because we as supply chain designers and architects and leaders haven't asked or pushed for it. So we're just deferring to the CIOs who are not trained or experienced in this. And so there's been a lot, and I write in my book and I reference a lot of articles criticizing the IT organizations.
I think the experience of an IT organization taking what used to be called the nobody gets fired for hiring IBM approach. And, if you're buying something that's all blue, nobody gets fired for it, there's a sense of safety there. And this also kind of taps on a topic I know you have some strong feelings about. Some of the really large firms like the Gartners and such that are pure pay to play. Like Gartner's never going to write about us because we're not going to pay them six figures just to talk to us. So that kind of over-reliance or over-indexing on something that's purported to be an authority but has enough bias in it. And I know there's a sensitivity around bias with AI and everything else going on. So overcoming this same bias to go and take in other sources of information, of advice in making the system selection or recommending the system selection, because the one ring to rule them all as a system is kind of outdated. As you said, we're a little past that. I don't think I have one app to rule them all on my iPhone.
No, of course not. How do I say this without? So, look, everybody's financially incented to come up with who's paying Gartner. Gartner's being paid by the big systems providers, and even to some degree the little systems provider. It's essential pay to play, and same with Forrester and all the others. So there's an implicit bias. It's beyond bias. It's almost, well, I won't go as far as to say it's fraud, but it's on its way to being that. And so you have this pay to play just in the rankings, because if there wasn't payments to Gartner, they wouldn't really exist. And I'm overstating that a bit for effect, but and then you have the systems integrators who are getting money. They build entire practices around deploying these big systems, the same systems that are on the Magic Quadrant. And at some point, you hire management consultants to validate the business cases, and everybody's getting paid in that equation. So how is that making the right choice? It becomes so insular, or even
Echo chamber.
echo chamber. What's the nepotism or incestuous? That's what I was looking for. But it's all of those things. So you're not getting independent voices in that. You're just getting everybody scratching everybody's back. And the sales reps for the tech company get their Mercedes, the systems integrator partners get their new Lexus, and the Gartners of the world get to be the facilitators of all of this and walk around like they own the place. And what's happening is, and that's fine, but at some point, all of those people, it's like the emperor with no clothes or the emperor's new clothes, whatever that children's story is. At some point, the emperor and the entire court are walking down the street naked because nobody's bothered to tell them, or they're not listening, or they're just not listening to anybody, and they're embarrassing themselves. And that's really what we get to. And a lot of my work is shining the light on this dynamic and showing that y'all are just living in an alternate reality because we have to start moving in this other direction. And so, yeah, anyway.
I love it because there's the natural sense of safety, and there's an entire, it's almost a culture around reinforcing the sense of authority that comes from a quadrant and so on. So shining that light on how that quadrant is developed is also very, very important and very insightful for a lot of organizations that perhaps don't necessarily appreciate how and where that ends up being made or how that sausage is made.
Yeah, but before you go on, I want to just go back to that big blue, or nobody gets fired for choosing IBM. In supply chain, and I have this quote somewhere, nobody gets fired for choosing SAP. And that may be true, but that doesn't mean you don't get fired, but you don't necessarily succeed either. Because, and this is what they don't tell you, and this is why I challenge supply chain leaders to take ownership of your own destiny, because you will get partway through the journey. And I think what happens is, while leaders don't get fired, it becomes clear they're not going to succeed. So they leave long before the failure becomes apparent. And I think they see it sooner and they move on for whatever reason. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one correlation, but there is this, you can choose the big solution, but that does not guarantee, in fact, that almost guarantees you won't be successful.
I know two examples come to mind. There's one organization who had planned on taking a smaller, bite-sized step forward to go and level up their procurement and supply chain. And through an end-of-year discount, they were offered one hell of a deal. And then they came through the end of that after signing it and went, oh shit, it's going to cost us how much to implement all of this and take how long? And another where, I think it's the third time that a large systems provider has, one of the large suite providers promised an organization that they do everything. And don't worry, we meet all your requirements this time for the third time.
Yeah.
Even though the last two times they didn't. And it's amazing how short some memories are that way, isn't it? It's unbelievable sometimes because there's this sense that there actually exists a unicorn. I've never met one. I've heard that these mythic crystal creatures exist. Have you ever met somebody that's actually been able to find and buy a unicorn?
No, of course not. I mean, first of all, the oldest trick in the sales playbook, in the software sales playbook, is we don't have that now, but it's on the roadmap. On the roadmap is code for, we'll think about putting it in a couple of years, but I'm going to string you along. And it's just this carrot, or like, those of you that are like the Charlie Brown comics, this is Lucy and Charlie Brown kicking the football. For those where every time Lucy pulls the football back and Charlie Brown ends up on his back because he's kicking air. And it's the same over and over and over again. So no, there's no unicorns. And then you really have to just stop and take an evaluation of what is the technology that we are being shown, because what shows up in the demo and in the PowerPoint is nothing like what gets deployed. And oftentimes you use the word safety. I think all of us, there's a natural gravitation to doing what's defensible. I had checked Gartner's Magic Quadrant. I went with the systems integrator's best practice, quote unquote. So I don't know why it failed. It's not my fault. When nobody wants to really take the initiative, and I have a client that's going to spend 10 years and $1 billion to put in S4. And I'm not picking on S4. This is actually not, but it's just 10 years and $1 billion. And One thing I will tell you is S4, whether it's good or bad, I'm not even making a value judgment, but it is not a future-based tool. It is a right now tool, or maybe if we're being critical, it's a yesterday tool. But it is, regardless, it's not a 10-year from now tool. So if you're going to spend 10 years putting in a system that's arguably out of date today, or soon to be out of date, then what are we doing? $1 billion? I mean, give me 500 million and I'll build something from scratch. And that's the question in the debate that we're not having.
That idea of how much is reasonable
Yeah,
and the size and scale and scope of reason is quite remarkable. I still shudder and really struggle to understand how an organization, aside from a significant amount of indecision and lack of clarity on who actually does what around here, would ever need to spend anywhere even a quarter of that. So
right.
it is spectacularly impressive to imagine the size and scale of the professional services involved in that sort of a project.
Right.
Uh,
But you have people coming in and just they're quoting whatever Magic Quadrant or whatever Gartner report or best practice or systems integrator, and again, you throw some management consultants in there, and all of a sudden you've got this big behemoth thing, and nobody's stopping and asking, is that even the right direction? Because of course the CIO and the IT organization is like, yeah, we buy into this because that's 10 years worth of work for us. And by the way, we are at an inflection moment, and I know AI is overhyped right now, but we are at this iPhone moment with this cloud computing moment like we've had over the last couple decades of where AI is going to be a fundamental transformation. And we're also going to have new business models. And you're seeing this with a lot of the tech companies that are just downsizing because they don't need all those people. They've just been, keeping all those people on. But the reality is the way we work is changing so dramatically. So the idea that we would put in a massive ERP system that'll take 10 years, I mean, you're going to be paying that debt for decades.
I would hope that that's at least a 7-year asset as a depreciation term. But even that, the amortization on something that size is not a check I would like to need to sign off on.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite questions that a guest had shared was who's signing the contract and who's signing up for the business case?
Well, whoever it is not going to be there when that bill comes due. I mean, so let's look at it from a different angle. Like there is a whole cottage industry of expert witnesses that you can hire when companies sue the big tech companies for failed ERP implementations. I mean, that is a real thing. Well, what does that tell you? That tells you that whoever's signing off on this is not doing their due diligence, and then you get to somewhere along the way and something fails, and there are spectacular public failures and thousands more. I don't know. Let's just say gazillions more that are not public. And so, what's that tell you? It tells you that it doesn't matter who signs the contract. Those benefits, those business objectives, those ways of working never come to pass. And that's why, as a critic that I am of these big implementations, it's easy because I could just sit there and poke holes in this all day because nobody challenges that these issues exist. It's a well-known secret, but I want us as a supply chain profession to take ownership and do something different. And that's why I write about new things we can do that are different. And it does not mean rip SAP out and do something different, although that is an option. But I'm just saying, let's drive the bus instead of being drug along behind it.
Yeah, there's a whole combination of things that go in with it, right? There's time scale of whatever change is being managed. That really epitomizes the bite-size transformation and the time horizon of economic and other incentives for the executives and leaders in organizations. Because once you get past a year or maybe a few years, typically the long-term incentives no longer are relevant. And if you're past a few years, this is probably outside of the time horizon of some upwardly mobile leaders in the organization that are looking to make a difference and move on. So I think there's a general idea that transformations that are more than a year or two long are risky on many levels. When we imagine that there's no unicorn, And by that, I had this disagreement with the salesperson who was saying, no, we do not admit that there is anything missing in our suite. And it was a remarkable conversation because, the conversation kind of went something like, he didn't like something that I said in a room full of people. And then from there, it turned into he didn't want anyone from my team working anywhere around something that he was doing because he saw risk in a sales process. And this was immensely clarifying for me. And I've always found it immensely valuable to go and seek to understand, right? Like understand how somebody else thinks. And what crystallized for me in this interaction was that the pursuit of the deal is actually this person's entire being, right? Like this is their entire reason for being. It's not solve the customer's problem. It is the pursuit of the signature on the 3-year, 5-year deal. And this is maybe this is a Captain Obvious moment for some. They'll be like, Sean, you mean you just figured this out? I'm like, well, I've always loved to believe that there's a little bit more interest in what's in it for the customer. But what ended up happening is, fast forward a while, that same deal, this person was happy about winning. We were introduced by a chief customer office for a very unhappy customer because it didn't do something that we happened to do. And if you rewind, had we been introduced earlier, we would have solved this pain point. And that would have been a happy customer from the beginning, as opposed to an escalated customer that was unhappy because it didn't do something they were promised. I love the scrutiny that you're encouraging to go make sure that the demo really does what you said it was going to do. And this typically means greater diligence through the procurement, supply chain, and IT leadership to make sure that it really does what you need and not to minimize some of those really important features.
And if I could interject, there's a huge difference between making money and solving problems. And sometimes we conflate the two because in your example, the idea that I sold the software, we automatically go to, oh, well, that's going to solve our problems. No, all it did was we transacted and we purchased something, but that doesn't mean we actually solved the problem. It's really bad with tech. However, it's true in consulting too, because you can have very successful consulting people that don't actually change or do what they promise. I may or may not be working on a book about consulting, but
I look
it's
forward to
not.
reading
I'm
that
not
too.
just picking on the sales, software sales folks.
So one of the things that I've heard you say, speaking of picking on, because I've always believed that it's important to have open voices and open discussion, and this concept that opinions and ideas might not be your favorite, but if you ignore them or pretend they don't exist or immediately offended by them instead of seeking to understand them, then you're continued doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. So I've heard you say, and I'm curious to hear more, that some of these large suites and the ERPs that they're designed to go with have this dichotomy. And I was hoping you could elaborate on that, because what's underlying that?
So, well, part of it is that there's not an open exchange of ideas. And look, all the big tech companies deserve a lot of credit for building something that is successful, that has made a lot of people a lot of money. And as a capitalist or a person that works within the capitalist system, there's something very satisfying about that. And I don't think we have to take anything away from that as on its own. However, what happens, and you're witnessing this with Salesforce in real time right now, is you hit a plateau. And at a certain point, unless you can move laterally, the organization, actually, better example is Google, because they got very comfortable. They even wrote the white paper on large language models, and they did nothing with it. And it's because they become, I don't know for sure, and it'll be decades or years before we find out exactly. But in essence, they've become middle-aged, they become risk-averse, et cetera, et cetera. And then it takes somebody like Sam Altman and OpenAI to come along, take that idea, and create a world-changing business. And what happens is there's not an open exchange of ideas. It's not democratized like it was, and people get comfortable. And this is not a criticism. This is human nature, and we don't want to fail, so we don't take big risks.
I love it. Dr. Eloise It is such a pleasure, and I love that you bring contrasting perspectives and ideas to the marketing mouthpieces that are out there saying what some of the large organizations would like people to say. And I want to take a moment to celebrate you for sharing those ideas and to be willing to go out there with some things that are maybe some uncomfortable things that need to be said out loud. So thank you so much for joining, for sharing. And I hope all of you can join for the next episode of The Never Ending Climb for a stronger supply chain and procurement for companies running SAP. Thanks so much, guys. See you next week.